Okay, we are live. All right, so we're going to be talking about abortion and possibly talking about trans surgeries. And this is for the Society Project that has no name yet. So let's go ahead and let's start with Marcelo. Maybe a 1 or 2 minute stance on abortion, and then I'll pick another person to go to.
Yeah, abortion is one of those really complicated topics because it involves a lot of cultural issues, sensibilities, religious views, and stuff like that. In the end of the day, I tend to favor the fact that having kids, right? Some of us here will have kids and etc. They know the impact kids have in our lives, and sometimes uh, unwanted pregnancies happen. Sometimes pregnancies are born out of violence or other situations. And I tend to view laws as only valid when they are applicable. If they're not applicable, what's the point, right? And that's why having very specific cutouts, it's very complicated, right? Because whenever we hear the discussion about, people are having abortions at 2 hours before 40 weeks or something like that, that's the fringest of the fringest cases, right? And it's usually for medical reasons or there's some sort of disgrace and etc. Could it have happened maliciously and etc.? I believe so. All right, the world is varied and there are a lot of crazy people around, but that's not the stance. And my final point here as an opening is that we really should listen to the women, all right? And they are the most impacted part out of it, right? And I say that as a father, but I think that we have to listen what I have to say. And women sometimes lead complicated lives all around the world, right? Sometimes this 12, 20 week and etc. discussion is very US and Eurocentric, and all around the world things are much more complicated and nuanced. I speak as a Brazilian living now in Spain, having lived in other places, Poland and etc. So I know that the discussion, I have changed my views according to the places that I was living in. Yeah.
All right. Phil, what's your opening couple minutes?
On a side note, real quick, I just want to let you know, Marcelo, you speak English very well, but the combination of the accent, with more importantly the low sound volume, I just had to pay close attention. I just want to let
Right.
you know. So that
I'll
might
try
have
to
been.
fix it up. Yeah. Thanks.
Um, my stance is that reasonable people can certainly disagree in the middle of abortion. You know, like if at 20 weeks, at 12 weeks, at, you know, but, once you get to like 30 something weeks, we're definitely dealing with a human being. And things are complicated when perhaps consent was not fully there, or other complicating issues. So I totally agree with the problem that it isn't simply every case of like two people agree to have consensual sex, um, don't make any attempts to use contraception, and then they wait around for a while and find a reason where they're like, you know what, I don't feel like having the baby, I'm going to have an abortion. But we do sort of need to pin down which case we're talking about, because things are totally transformed. The discussion is totally transformed if we're not talking about consensual sex, if we're not talking about a medical reason, if we are talking about toward the end of the pregnancy. And oftentimes it is said that, well, abortions at the very end of the pregnancy are, exceedingly rare. Well, okay. So if it's exceedingly rare, and we agree that we're dealing with a human being at that point, then let's make the agreement that if there's no rape involved, and there's no and it is late term abortion, that we can ban that. And then we can have a different discussion about the rest of, because it is a complex issue. At the very beginning of abortion, you're dealing with, at the very beginning of conception, you're dealing with just a cell. It's not a human being. And at the very end, you are dealing with a human being. And so it's a tough issue. And somewhere in between, we have to grapple with that. And we have to take into consideration that you have a parent, a woman who has her own rights. Absolutely. It's just that, her right to force a human being into existence and then decide to kill that human being, that also requires a little bit of something we should be looking at. So yeah, I do take a 12-week stance, which I'm flexible on. If someone can convince me that actually no, like a 13-week-old pregnancy is not something we should be morally concerned with, then I can certainly I can change my flexibility on that. I'm not a intransigent. I'm not unable to change my opinion when I receive new information. So that's the way I feel about it.
All right. Let's go to Travis now.
Yeah, so I'm just going to repeat what I said in my discussion with Harley, which is that my 12-week cutoff, that's kind of a tentative position. I don't it's not a firm belief that, it has to be at 12 weeks. That's just kind of where I'm leaning right now. The reason for that is because there is a paper called Reconsidering Fetal Pain, which argued that fetal pain may begin to arise at that point. Since we're dealing with people who are taking a rather extreme pro-choice position, I would ask, do you think it's okay to kill a newborn infant? And if not, what's the morally relevant difference between a newborn infant and a late-term fetus that justifies killing one but not the other?
All right. And then, so Jeremy, you could either come in with your stance, or if you feel like it's not too much different than Marcelo, you could just join by answering Travis's question.
Yeah, I had a feeling it was going to be quite different. And I don't know how much of my thoughts Travis or Phil has heard, but I don't take a very strong moral quote unquote pro-choice position. I don't take a strong stand that that all or even most abortions are morally better or morally right decisions. I take a fairly strong political pro-choice position. In fact, I think the concept of pro-choice is a political stance and not a moral stance. I said it in exactly those terms to Carson previously. I believe there's very clearly a huge distinction between which acts we regard as immoral, even very seriously immoral, and which acts we think ought to be criminalized by the state. More often, it's good that Phil's here, who's a Christian, because I more often find myself arguing to vegans that having the priority of criminalizing animal consumption as soon as possible is a terrible idea that will backfire in the form of civil war, organized crime. I'm typically arguing to vegans that you can't just wave it. You can't just say illegal and act like it means waving a magic wand and making something disappear. Mm-hmm. It actually involves the empowerment of police and prosecutors to try to stop something, and then people respond with secrecy, with funding organized crime, with using defensive violence against the people who are trying to use police violence against them. And so the analogy that I would make to a Christian like Phil in the reverse is, we have plenty of religious behaviors that I would consider extremely morally wrong. Teaching young children about hell, where their non-believer, quote unquote, non-believer friends will will suffer for eternity if they don't properly accept Christ or embrace Islam in the case of that religion. That's terribly traumatizing. It's just abjectly evil. But I don't think that we should have a political policy of trying to criminalize those religions or the teaching of those religions because of the horrific societal consequences. So it's my primary argument is that there are immoral acts easy to think of that compare to the immorality of many abortions, which it similarly is not societally wise to try to oppose by the violent force of the state. And instead, we should try to convince people to, number one, try to convince pregnant women to make more morally informed decisions through intellectual, emotional persuasion, peaceful persuasion, and also try to contribute in whatever ways we can to reduce the situation arising, reduce the number of circumstances where these difficult abortion decisions have to be made in the first place, through solid sexual education and reproductive health care. But so that's my underlying point is that I'm taking a political stand when I say that I'm pro-choice, not a moral stand. But then with regard to the ethics of abortion, I would just say really quickly, Travis, you seem inclined towards negative consequentialism, and I'm very much not. I'm a general experientialist, consequentialist, somewhat close to hedonism. And so from my perspective, what seems like the biggest loss in the case of abortion
freezing up a bit
is the I'm getting this from freezing.
Yeah.
All right, I'm just gonna close whatever other windows I have open here. Strikes me as the biggest loss is the future happiness that would have resulted from that life, but I don't see any convincing argument that would distinguish abortion from contraception or just choosing not to reproduce in that case. There's no I don't believe in any kind of ensoulment, and I as a hedonist adjacent consequentialist, I think of well-being, positive and negative well-being, as a fact about the universe. And so if a good life does not come into being because of an abortion, or if it does not come into existence because of a condom, given that it's the same net positive well-being life, that being the main distinction, I don't see one there. So it would come up down to a degree of suffering being the only difference. And like I said, I can see many abortions being immoral because they inflict suffering upon a late stage fetus. And the question would just come down to what all the other trade-offs are,
Hey, Jeremy, just to push Travis's question a little further, or not further, but just to reiterate it, would you feel different about an execution a week after birth than an abortion a week before birth? Because I think that might have been more of what he was going for.
Only because of the, I would say not inherently. I agree with Peter Singer's controversial comments on this, that inherently I don't really accept any arguments that assign some vastly different right status to a baby 1 hour after birth from 1 hour before birth. Um, there are clearly likely instrumental differences. You know, a woman isn't facing any additional personal health risks after the baby is out of her, where she is at any point during pregnancy and looking forward, anticipating childbirth. Childbirth is, still in developed countries, a very risky procedure to undergo.
Gotcha.
And so yeah, those instrumental differences, what you have to trade off in order to keep a newborn alive and find a way to give it up for adoption seems to me almost always going to be much lower sacrifice than what you have to give up in order to continue a pregnancy and childbirth. That's the main difference.
In a sec, I think it'll be good to have Phil respond to what Jeremy initially said, comparing it to like religion and different moral things. But real quick, just keep going with Travis's question. Marcelo, do you have any different thoughts on why it would be okay to terminate, even if it's unlikely, but if it's legal, for the sake of inconvenience, saying there's no good reason, I'm about to give birth tomorrow, I want this baby terminated, versus a baby being born in a hospital and tied up in a garbage bag or something like that? And then Travis can kind of challenge you guys after you answer that one.
Sure. Yeah, I think that those brief introductions here show the difficulties, right? Because we have several different routes in which we can approach abortion. We have the religious route, political, philosophical, moral. All of them lead to different places, right? Which is complicated. In regarding to the question, I think this is a false equivalence, right? It's not a perfect analogy, right? Because things change, right? It's 2 meters is not the same between you and your room, and if you like, there's a black hole in the middle and you're after it, right? Things change due to some milestones. How you choose those milestones and etc. is subjective, and this is my problem with the moral argument, because this is basically a moral quandary, right? I think that morals are subjective, and if we stick to the moral part of this argument, I think that's why we have just so much controversy about this kind of stuff, because everybody's different. I don't believe in objective morals. I think that morals are all subjective, and that in itself is a polemic statement, and I understand that, but that's the foundation of my understanding regarding that. So after what we consider birth happens and the baby is in this world with the possibility of autonomy without the mother and etc., it changes, right? It changes in regard to the laws, and that's what we've had in most countries, some sort of provision in this regard, and medically, psychologically, in terms of how the mother sees the fetus versus the baby, stuff like that. So I think that it's an analogy that draws from the heat of the moral argument without really addressing the pragmatic choices. And I'm a pragmatic in this regard, first and foremost. I think that things need to be doable, like I said. That's why I mentioned in my reply that I'm okay with 20 weeks. All right. I'm, of course, leaning towards no limits. All right. That should be decided between the mother and the doctors. But if to protect more women and more kids and to cause less abortions, and the abortions that do happen, they are safer. If the price for that is a limit of 20 weeks, I'm cool with that, because that's a net positive in my sights. It will improve people's lives, and then the outliers can be defined by a court of law or for additional legislation. It's the first step.
Travis, do you want to challenge either of them?
Yeah, so I don't see how the question is a false equivalence. The question is just asking you, if you take a different attitude towards these two beings, what's the morally relevant difference between the two beings? I don't see how the question is a false equivalence.
No, my reply would be
Yeah, neither do I. I think. Oh,
no.
I
Sorry.
just I agree with Travis. It's very valid whether there's a basis for distinguishing between the status as a moral patient of a child shortly before birth and shortly after birth. And I think I agree with Peter Singer and many other consequentialists that there are no such grounds.
Well, then I'll just make a note that that question, it doesn't actually make a statement about the moral status of either the fetus or the newborn infant. It's just asking, well, if you take this view regarding the infant, what do you see as the morally relevant difference that justifies a different treatment or giving the fetus a different moral status?
Well, yeah, and I mean, I hope you're satisfied with my answer that it's primarily the large trade-off in the form of the dangers of pregnancy and childbirth that don't exist for a newborn.
Do you want to chip in, Phil?
Well, I will mention really quick that my faith consists largely just of my personal relationship with Christ, and it tends like I'll have people who will call me kind of will say a bad Christian, or one of my best friends will often call me an atheist Christian, because my faith consists purely just of a relationship with God, whether or not He exists. And I don't even really tend to look to the Bible for as many answers as I think 99% of Christians do. So I can't really wave the banner of being the Christian in the group and having a religious position. I will say that on the issue of subjectivity of morality, I agree. At a certain level of analysis, it has to be subjective, right? Morality cannot exist if there are not morally significant agents trying to ponder what that morality is. That's the only way it exists. But we all have it, right? We have our opinions and we have a basis for what we think is right or wrong. So I don't really see that necessarily as relevant, because in the end, someone's going to base their morality on, if I have my presupposition, which is that actually it's the consequence that matters. If someone else says, no, I have more of a deontological position, or a Christian chimes in and says, no, actually morality is just the arbitrary, received morality from Christ, from this book, then those are positions. And so I'm kind of curious, are we all consequentialists here?
I don't know. I wouldn't say I'm a consequentialist. I'm more of a pragmatic realist,
Okay.
more than anything else. Yeah. While I have no problem with consequentialism most of the time, I don't know. I think that it sometimes it kind of breaks down.
Okay. Well, I call myself, sorry to interrupt you, Travis. I call myself a deep consequentialist, which is that it matters very much how other people perceive the answers you come to as well. And so if you could convince everyone else you're right and what you're saying would work, that's fine. But if society views it differently, then you have to change your position, because that all of the subsequent consequences also matter. So go ahead, Travis. Sorry.
Oh, well, I was just going to say that, I don't think our meta-ethical views are going to be all that relevant to the conversation. I'm also a moral anti-realist. I don't think there is objective morality, so I don't think that's too relevant. And also, I would just say that I kind of think of this discussion as being entirely about morality. Like, even the question of whether it should be legal or not, like a legal stance is still a type of moral stance, right? Like, let's say if I think that something's morally wrong, but I also don't think it should be criminalized, like the reason I would take such a view is because I think it would be more morally wrong to criminalize it, right? So, like, say being rude, for example. Being rude is morally wrong, but it's more morally wrong to criminalize it, to criminalize
Yeah.
being rude. I just take
Yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
really know what it would mean for like this to be talk about it non-morally. Like I don't
Well,
know what it
no,
would
I
mean to
don't.
make legal prescriptions without it being like a moral kind of thing, a moral stance.
Yeah, I don't. I
Um,
don't. I don't think. I might have. You might have misunderstood my saying that morality and politics are separate. I don't mean
No,
to
I
say
think
that.
Travis was
My,
responding to Marcelo's comment on the moral side of it.
Yeah, I was
okay.
more responding to him, not you, Jeremy.
But yeah, real quick.
Okay. When I say it, I'm just talking about the consequences of criminalizing something, which are very complex and severe. The collateral damage of a state using violence in the form of police and courts and prisons is it adds a completely potentially game changing factor to what would otherwise be the moral status of an act.
I'm just
Um,
I'm oh, were you
oh,
gonna say something, Carson?
well, I got a hypothetical picture to paint that with Jeremy and Marcelo answering it can help you guys know a little more of where they're coming from, and it'll help me know as well. Imagine a hypothetical future where on a piece of land, we'll just call it Earth, we're able to grow babies in a lab. And so, two people that want a baby, man and a woman, they come, they bring their eggs, their sperm, and it starts growing in an incubator. So there's no woman's body involved. And then in this hypothetical, imagine there's all the resources in the world. There's all the money in the world. There's millions of people lined up wanting to adopt babies. So would there be any point where if somebody started having a baby, the baby's at conception, the baby goes to all these different stages, we got sentience, consciousness, all these viability, all these things, with there not being a mother's body involved, do either Jeremy or Marcelo think that there is a point where the parents can say, we don't want our human with our genetics in the world, we changed our mind? At what point are they not allowed to, and at what point would they be allowed to? And then maybe Phil and Travis can bounce off whatever you guys say.
It clearly takes away a lot of the major trade-offs against the well-being of the fetus, which are, again, the very serious risks of pregnancy and childbirth, and not only risks of something catastrophic happening, but reliable long-term negative health consequences to a woman's body for each child that she has.
Mm-hmm.
That's not something that should be discounted. There's biochemical kinds of deterioration.
Yeah, well, I feel like that can be brought back in
chronic,
once we discover what your value is of a human stage of life.
So those things get taken away in your thought experiment, and so then what will be left as the consequences to be traded off? Well, maybe something like a reasonable expectation of net negative well-being for the child's life were it to be born. Some kind of change in the circumstances where the parents now know that the child is going to be born into significant poverty or some risk of abuse, some fact that gets discovered that leads to the expectation that a child that was previously expected to have net positive well-being is now expected to have net negative well-being. Something like that would still exist in your thought experiment.
Yeah, for me, I think it takes most of the bite, because I think that most of my concern in relation to abortion is a concern for the mother. And if there is no risk, the mother is completely outside the uterus in this very artificial scenario where there is, I don't think so, any possibility of added violence or really unwanted pregnancy and stuff like that, then it's a very different story. Absolutely, right. I think that I would be much less inclined to have the views that I have right now. But even in this case, I would defer to the medical consensus in relation to the viability of the fetus. It would be a very big discussion about this, right? Because right now, I think that most of the confusion that arises out of this, besides the moral arguments, is this idea of the conception, right? When does conception happen, right? And the discussions about pain that were brought before, viability and stuff like that. And we would have to be pragmatic as I am, right? We would have to define, okay, this is it. This amount of days, weeks, months, whatever, would be the cutoff. But yeah.
All right, Travis or Phil, either of you guys could challenge him now that you know his stance with that hypothetical, or you can ignore that hypothetical and bounce to something else.
I will bounce if there's nothing that Travis immediately wants to say about that. I will mention that Travis, I watched after I left the other stream, after late term babies were called parasites. I did watch the rest of it, and you brought up an interesting analogy where you said, after the baby's born, would you allow the mother, or how did the analogy go with the button where you could press the button to kill the baby?
Yeah, so the thought experiment that I brought up in that discussion was like, say the mother, you have a newborn baby, right? Just a typical newborn baby, and the mother presses a button that now makes the newborn baby physically dependent on her, in the same way that a fetus is physically dependent on a mother. Would it now be acceptable for the mother to kill that baby?
One way in which we could slowly sort of expand on that is if someone says no, or they would say that the real crime there was to press the button in the first place. Why would you press a horrible button like that? We could then say, well, okay, what if there is some sort of motivation other than sadism to press the button? Like, you press the button and there's not 100% chance that it actually works to make the baby dependent on the mother, but there is 100% chance that it will make her come, right? It'll give her like a physical satisfaction, maybe even an emotional satisfaction, a sense of euphoria, but maybe only a 1% chance that it makes the baby again physically dependent on the mother. And then slowly what we see is evolving this analogy that really is more to how it works in real life, where someone has sex for the relationship, for the companionship, for the physical pleasure, and there's not 100% chance that it results in a pregnancy. And then we could sort of narrow into what about the evolution of that thought experiment from the perfect button thought experiment to the actual pregnancy. Like, where's the moral paradigm shift there? If everyone here agrees that it's immoral to push that button in the first place.
Yeah, what do you think, Marcelo? Or Jeremy?
So the big problem with the parasite description in the pro-choice literature and pro-choice conversation is that generally when the parasites that we typically think about, we have reason to believe have a very low level of sentience, if any sentience at all. If it were the case that each one of the lice infecting our hair had as much sentience as an average human, then our moral consideration about using the anti-lice shampoo would be extremely different. So so parasite, it technically refers to a kind of relationship, which there's a separate argument of whether a growing fetus has that similar status biologically, but regardless of that, there's this question of biological dependence in the definition of the word parasite, but in its connotation, it smuggles in our awareness that the bacteria, the tapeworms, the lice, or whatever, don't have a very high degree of sentience, don't have very high status as moral patients. And so to apply that to something that has a similar biological dependency but is much more highly sentient is an unreasonable move, clearly.
Yeah, the other thing about the parasite talking point, which I didn't point out at the time in that discussion, but someone later mentioned it to me, is that if you're going to say that the fetus is a parasite because it's physically dependent on the mother, I mean, and if you're going to say, oh, it's a parasite up until birth, I mean, like that's very strange. Like after the point of viability, it's like the fetus isn't is the fetus really physically dependent on the mother, because technically it could survive outside
Yeah.
of the womb. So
Couldn't you say it was a prisoner? The mother was
Yeah.
committing a crime of imprisoning the fetus when it would have been viable outside her. So she's the one committing an offense. Retaliatory force should be used against the person who's kidnapping somebody who could be viable on their own. It's ludicrous, right?
yeah, I also think that. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, just let me comment that I haven't watched this specific example that you people are mentioning, but I find it a very curious analogy, right? To consider even thinking about the baby as a parasite, while I think that the more biologically adept comparison would be a symbiotic relationship, because that's what it is, right? The baby is not there to draw upon the mother in a detrimental manner. Nature has capacities and mechanisms that ensure that this doesn't happen. One of the reasons why women are also more long-lived than men is because sometimes of birthing benefits. Right, there are changes in the female biology and etc. that promote that promotes health benefits and stuff like that. So I think it's very weird. And while I think that the thought experiments are interesting, I would like maybe to bring the real life into the discussion. All right. So what happens right now in the world in regards to abortion? Because it's all nice and dandy to bring uh, philosophy and sophistry and Schopenhauer and Wittgenstein and etc. And that's all good, right? I love philosophy, but that's why I'm a pragmatic, right? While we can make a very good philosophical argument for X or Y, it does it really matter when people are dying, women are dying, when we are passing extremely toxic legislation in some parts of the world towards whatever means you're on the side, right? It doesn't matter if it's pro-life or pro-choice and etc., right? We are talking sometimes about convicting like the women as murderers for abortion, which I don't see how, frankly, right? It's a complete abomination, and the anything goes approach of it's a free for all and etc. I don't think that that's where the meat and the potatoes of the discussion is, right? I think that the real point here is how are women using abortion? Why do they have abortions? What is the impact of abortions in society? And then how do we deal with this reality? I think that the political debate and to a lesser extent the emotional moral debate is a bit divorced from the reality, and that's a detriment. I think that it allows people to sneak in bad arguments that can be spun out of control. Philosophy is great at doing that.
Yeah,
That's
well,
why
so really quick, I just want to say, Marcelo, I think you make a good point, and I think we should go over those details, and I think that leads us to crafting things like 20 weeks and these various ideas. But to make sure that there are cutoffs for very specific things, kind of like Phil was talking about earlier, to make sure, like, even if it's rare, even if it doesn't happen, it might be good to say if there's no medical reason and this person wants this action to happen, that unless there's a good reason not to, we call it illegal. So I just want to bring up Phil's thought experiment real quick, because I think it was important that we all went over the parasite idea. But to go over that button idea, imagine a handful of scenarios. So if you imagine just a mom with a newborn at home, it's 1 day old, and she just kills it and tells the authorities, I killed it because I decided it stressed me out and I didn't want to drive it down to put it up for adoption. So imagine what you would want the legal repercussions to be in that scenario. And then imagine if you feel that that's different from if the mother got home, the baby's 1 day old, and she presses the button and it's attached to her, and then she wants it killed to remove it. And then the third thing to imagine, if you agree that both of those two are murder and should be punished in a sense of murder, then if the third and last hypothetical scenario is somebody has sex, they're not raped, they had sex intentionally, they find out they're pregnant, they let themselves be pregnant up until the day before birth, and then they choose they want to kill it. Is if you accept that, how is that different from pressing that button? I think is what Phil was asking. So Marcelo, go ahead, and then Jeremy, if you want to answer it differently than Marcelo, then yeah, let's do that.
Sure. I would agree that if the baby was already born, everything that happens after that is murder, right? Again, pragmatic realism, right? That's realistically what's going on, right? At that stage, the baby is viable, right? And again, there are nuances, right? The baby was born with hydrocephaly, and it's in a terrible situation. The family is deprived, and those are the nuances that are sometimes missing in those discussions. But considering like a stable, average scenario, yeah, I wouldn't have any qualms in calling that murder. Absolutely.
Even
And
pressing the
about-
button.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think so. Yeah,
Okay.
I think so, because that's effectively the end result. The end game is that, and the
Jeremy,
process
can I-
doesn't really
okay.
matter. Go on.
I was just going to ask Jeremy if I could cut you in line real quick just to make a point because I do have to leave in a couple minutes. Okay. I wanted to bring up the point of what you were saying, Marcelo, with really just having a white room philosophical discussion and then deciding that law should then be used to reflect on that. And Jeremy's made this point several times, actually. Is not necessarily the right way to do it. And I agree, and I've seen this a lot in economics, actually, where people will look at the results of an economic system and say, that's not fair, and let's do this, ham-fisted approach at trying to make the world more fair, when in fact it may or may not actually have the effects that you're looking for in the end, right? It may not result in the effects you're looking for in the end. That's the same case when it comes to criminal law. And so I definitely agree with that point. I will say though, and the idea that it's murder to kill a very late-term fetus doesn't strike me as like ridiculous or divorced from reality in any way. And that's why I think it's important for like Travis's point of like, if you have a fetus which is actually 1 week overdue versus a baby which was born 2 weeks premature, they're the same. Arguably, the fetus who's been in there 3 weeks longer, that's more of a developed human being than the baby who's been born and held and fed and crying. So I don't think it's ridiculous at the very, very end of the pregnancy to consider that murder. But yeah, and I don't want to throw the conversation completely off with Jeremy giving his response. But I have to go, and I will listen to you guys from here on.
All right. Have a good one,
Okay.
Phil. We'll see.
Take care, Phil.
Okay, so Marcelo, you were about to say so you already said your thoughts on the regular killing, the pressing the button. So what were your thoughts on why you might think it should still be legal in that hypothetical I gave of the pregnant person deciding a day before birth to have it aborted?
Because of the difference between a fetus and a baby, right? Which I will concede that it's arbitrary, right? It's a classification issue. I think that while the fetus is still tied to the mother, that's the fetus, and that it is in the purview of the woman, all right? In this,
But when she presses the button after it's born and now it's still attached to her, is the problem just because she went against nature? Because it's still doing the exact same thing the fetus is doing where it's attached to her. We can even say it's inside of her. It's right back inside just to deliver it again.
Yeah. Frankly, I haven't given this scenario much thought. I would say that it's different because it feels different for me, right? Because even though it's attached to it, it's a different classification. It's a different scenario. And I don't know. I would probably consider that much more morally reprehensible than to have a what we call a traditional abortion
Gotcha.
in the current terms. Yeah.
All right, Jeremy.
I wanted to say that it seems to me that legal systems make distinctions that are at least as arbitrary, if not much more so, all of the time. Age of majority is a major example. If any of us were to have sex with somebody one day before their 18th birthday, we would, or whatever the age is over there, Marcello,
Yeah.
we would face very serious consequences. Whereas if we were to have sex with someone on their 18th birthday one day later, we would face no consequences. The underlying moral difference is just clearly not there. Another example would be something like legal distinctions between petty larceny and grand larceny. If you say stole something that was valued at slightly less than $1,000 or slightly more than $1,000, you could potentially face very different legal penalties. So these kind of things exist in law, and I don't have much disagreement with the common sentiment that as long as the law is well publicized and understood, and people are able to know what the law is in advance, then there's not a huge problem with that. It's something that you have to do in order to have a clear rules for a functioning system. Even though the underlying moral distinction is very, very minimal between stealing, $990 worth of something or $1,000 worth of something, or the absent the law, the moral difference between somebody engaging in sex one day apart. Go ahead.
Just a comment, and I agree with you in general terms. In Brazil, the judge won't convict anybody that's proven to be stealing out of hunger, for instance, right? It's very rare if you're caught on supermarket stealing food and etc., and you're not stealing whiskey or something else that's obviously not something to provide for their family. You probably just get a slap on the wrist, right? Maybe some hours of community service, and that's it. Even though theoretically everything is theft, right? So this is where intent matters, right? And that's why we have, on those fringe cases, we have to look at each and every one of those scenarios, because just setting up the scenario without understanding the mother, all right? What's the situation of the mother? What's the situation of the baby, of the family, of the society? The example becomes a bit soulless, and because of that, I think useless. But when you consider the situation of the individuals involved, then you can have a better understanding. And that's what a good law should do, right? It should give the legal system the tools to analyze and to dictate what happens in each case. Yeah.
So one other thing that I should bring in here, because it's not exactly on point of your button pressing experiment, but you're talking about the example of consensual sex producing the fetus as one of the distinguishing factors. I wanted to say that, Carson, when you had a talk with Wendy a while back, I completely agreed with her on one point, had me sort of vigorously nodding my head, which is that sexual coercion is not binary. It's not either on or off. So this kind of convenient move that people often do, especially people that consider themselves pro-life, as they say, well, as long as it wasn't rape, as if that's something that you can kind of hand wave away and justify your opposition to abortion on the grounds that you're carefully carving out, that you're neatly carving out this category called rape from other cases that result in pregnancy. And Wendy was exactly right. The way that sexual coercion can play between two people in an encounter is very clearly continuous. And also, she mentioned things like societal pressure, that especially in certain kinds of conservative communities, family pressure that creates circumstances where we wouldn't want to say that it meets the burden of proof to convict someone of sexual assault in court and send them to prison, but nevertheless it's not fully, or it's not extremely on the consensual end of the continuum, or the mutually beneficial, mutually respecting end of the continuum of sexual encounters. There are elements of pressure and implicit coercion and lack of fully informed free action that are involved in a lot of these cases.
Yeah, well, I think it would come down to the same way we judge that outside of pregnancy. So if somebody claims that they were sexually assaulted, and then a bunch of questions are asked, and then it's all like, oh, well, he said please, and I said no, and he's like, no, come on, please, and I said no, but after 10 times, I gave in and did it. So we could decide various different things as lawmakers. We can just say, oh, that's super douchey and immoral, stop doing it, but we can't legally prosecute it because that was just you giving into pressure. Or we could be a society that says that kind of pressure, if it's proven, caught on film and audio, that we'd say there's jail time. And that's up for us to decide. We can decide that as a society. But the same way we decide that, we could decide the same thing about somebody that's pregnant, that one person might call rape and one might not, and say, oh, well, I should be able to have an abortion because I was pressured into the sex. And then that's why we'd have to decide as a society, if we want to have an exception for rape, do we include something like somebody saying please 10 times, or do we not? And so I don't think we just shut it all out because there's a fuzzy line.
So I think, Carson, my consistent position is against increasing the power of police and courts. So I would require a quite high standard for convicting a man of rape and sending him to prison. But by the same token, I would require some kind of very high standard of full consensuality in order to morally judge a woman who ends up wanting to have an abortion. These middle ground cases that Wendy was talking about, it presumably in her community where she grew up, she was well acquainted with them. Those are the kind of cases where I would neither want to send the man to prison, nor would I want to take away the woman's political power to make a choice concerning her body and her future that results from that middle ground, fuzzy kind of sexual encounter.
Gotcha. Yeah. I have some thoughts on that, but I think I'll let Travis hop in. Travis, did you have any comments on Jeremy's pointing out that we have to pick an arbitrary line of, the difference between a 17 and an 18-year-old? And do you think that applies how he's saying pressing the button a day after birth to make a baby attached to you versus the day before birth, that we just have to pick an arbitrary line? Do you think that line makes sense to put there based on what Jeremy said?
So I do agree that, at least for some laws, there is going to be an arbitrary line. Like with the age of consent, it's kind of like, well, there's no really good reason to put it at any one particular point. But we do need to put it somewhere, right? Because we clearly see a difference between like a 2-year-old and like a 35-year-old. But so I do agree in that sense that there are going to be arbitrary cutoffs sometimes, but I don't necessarily agree. Well, I don't know if he said this, but I don't think that all legal cutoffs are going to be arbitrary.
Gotcha. Well, and the arbitrary line could also be in various different spots, similar to you. 17 is close to 18, but if you keep saying that, then eventually you get to 13 and 12, and so you do have to have a number, and it has to make sense. But just because numbers have to exist somewhere, doesn't just wipe out the question of abortion. I think that's why some people would say, oh, okay, yes, a number has to be there, but if I care about sentience, it has to be at 12 weeks. If I care about viability, it has to be at 20 weeks. And so it's still going to be arbitrary because there will be some fetuses that start having consciousness at, like 19 weeks, but some at 24 weeks. So we're not going to be able to encompass every single one into one. The question's really just going to come down to, even if we consider an act of abortion immoral, do we think it should be permissible? And so that's why I think it's kind of complicated. In my mind, I would say if you've had enough time up until 20 weeks, now I even say 12 weeks, but I'm just saying up until 20 weeks to have had the abortion, find out you're pregnant, all this stuff, and you choose to let it continue, aside from some edge cases, which this whole thing is an edge case because they almost never happen after 20. But for the ones that do happen after 20, the idea that somebody would want to fight a ban saying, if there's no medical concern and all you want to do is not have this human living anymore, saying you're not allowed to choose that after 20 weeks, that makes perfect sense to me. So I guess it's the idea is convincing fellow humans that their moral stance should say, even though it's immoral, it should be legal to terminate it for no good reason.
I do have a question for Jeremy. So, Jeremy, is your position on this that abortion should be legal up until the point of birth?
I should also say that in the concept of this society designing experiment, we're supposed to be creating our own sort of unitary society consisting of ourselves, or I guess millions of copies of each of us, or something like that, which doesn't have any women, so it's not going to be, or has one maybe.
There is one woman.
Okay. That's kind of like how Genesis goes in the Bible, right?
Just so you can get a better picture of it, how I imagine it is there's 30 of us senators, and what we are voting on and deciding on is essentially what we would want to convince other people of. By sharing our opinions, we would hope to move the majority to hear what we're saying and go, oh, that makes sense, I like it, or to hear the argument and go, no, I prefer that guy's argument. So
Okay.
we don't have to imagine that we're controlling everybody, and we also don't have to imagine that they are carbon copies of us. It's what would our argument be to convince other people of how a society should exist. And
Yeah,
go
the
on.
key thing is that a society would just be our society, and it wouldn't apply to the current state of the U.S. right now. And so I wanted to make that point to Travis that my answer is really, my political answer is really taking into account the current state of the U.S. and the foreseeable consequences. So I might have to change it in order to keep to the terms of the society building experiment. But the reason,
Well, sorry to cut in one more time. Actually, I think that probably forever, but at least for right now, we should view it as if we're looking at outcomes and stats as the U.S. right now. So if we're deciding on something, even though our society is hypothetical, it's the U.S.'s stats.
Okay. So yeah, Travis, my main response to you is that the reason I'm politically pro-choice, being in the U.S. today, despite seeing many abortions as potentially very morally wrong, has to do with my fears of empowering the police and the courts to a greater extent, and also what seems the incipient likelihood of outright violence and something like civil war on various state lines between various parts of the country. I just see that as such a great, a likely potential of very negative consequences. That the thing to do is, um, as with drugs and many other things, is to have this legal and attempt to use moral persuasion and the tools of civil society, um, you know, charity, advocacy groups, and whatnot to bring about better moral decisions by individuals rather than the violence of the state.
So I'm still a bit confused. Like when you say you're politically pro-choice, do you mean pro-choice like all the way, or
Up until birth,
yeah? Because there you could be pro-choice and think there's like a cutoff at some point, right?
well, it partly depends upon the numbers. It might a late term abortion ban might actually be enforceable, practically enforceable, because the numbers of people interested in them, considering them, is quite small compared to the overall abortion rate. But if the numbers were large enough that there would still be a radical political difference between the law in Illinois and the law in Indiana, and then very people with strong moral, usually religious convictions on one side are going to physically arm themselves and try to stop the other side from coming across the border to get what they consider to commit what they consider to be first degree murder of babies. And then the side that considers it to be a fundamental civil right of women arms themselves to protect the women. And you have conflicts all along borders like that, of which there are many throughout the country. I think we can reasonably foresee consequences that are worse than the original problem that we might have wished to solve.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I asked is because I was just curious if you would think, if you would say that banning abortion, or like the kind of abortion bans or cutoffs that are being proposed here, if you would say that that lowers utility in the world.
Do I think that it might very well lower utility to have a ban on abortions past 20 weeks? Yeah, for the reason I suggest, that the level of open violence that very well might exist with states geographically adjacent states with very different viewpoints, as we have in the U.S. right now, and different factions within those states, it's a great risk. And much of the same reasons, very similar reasons why I favor decriminalization of drugs that I think, morally, in and of themselves, have pretty clear negative utility in society. And I believe that the criminalization of those drugs currently leads to much larger negative utility. And so I would hold the same view in our current climate of something like 20-week bans.
Yeah, so I did a stream. I don't know if you saw it, but I had a stream with Jerome a while ago, and we were talking about abortion. And one of the things I said in that stream was, in terms of abortion's effect on utility, I would say, like, I'm agnostic in regards to that. I think the overall impact of abortion, or like outlawing abortion, on utility, I think that's very unclear which policy would be better for utility.
One other thing, Travis, I mentioned it already, but to reiterate, that I think a lot of people who come out morally against abortions they're correctly perceiving the loss of future happiness, the loss of a future life with lots of positive experiences in it. And I agree that is the major loss. It's probably in many cases much greater than the actual suffering that takes place during an abortion itself, is the loss of that person's happy life. But I don't find any compelling reasons to accept any ethical difference between that loss of potential life and the loss of potential life whenever anybody uses contraception and never conceives in the first place, or just chooses not to have sex, whatever. Just all the potential humans who could have been born who are not being born is similarly a loss of potential positive well-being in the universe. So I think people are making that ethical error, and that's playing a role in their conclusions about abortion. Is they're following. I mean, many philosophers have defended the position that calculations of well-being can only apply to someone who already exists. But I don't find those arguments compelling.
Well, I would in terms of the potential life lost, I mean, if we're going to say that it should be legal, are we confident that the suffering caused by criminalizing it would outweigh the additional happy lives brought into existence?
Okay. So are you you're invoking the idea not that there's something significantly different between having an abortion and using contraception in terms of each preventing a life, but you're saying, yeah, for each abortion that takes place, it doesn't sort of automatically cause somebody else to conceive elsewhere, right? So there's not this compensating life. So the intervention of outlawing abortions would just create larger population, more lives, and so those lives would contribute to aggregate well-being. That is a good argument. And then I mean, it would probably that's the kind of consideration that plays the largest role in my saying that I would be morally against many abortions. I think many people are making an error, and they would actually add a lot of well-being to the world if they made the choice instead to bring that child into existence and raise it with the best life.
Yeah, I would be I am sometimes morally against several different kinds of abortion, but I simply think that doesn't matter, right? What matters is the end result and the realities of it, right? And again, it's very easy to get stuck on a few fringe cases that highlight some depravity or some really abnormal situation, right? Even the discussion is a bit weird, right? Because if you get the numbers from the CDC, and I'm double checking them here just now, just to make sure that I have the right numbers in mind. Again, since we're talking about the US, I'm using CDC, right? So we are talking here that late after the 21st week of the pregnancy, the number of abortions is basically 1%, right? So 99% abortions take place up to the 20th week. If you look at the 12th week, 66% around 6 weeks, 15% around 9 to 10 weeks, and 8% 10 to 12 weeks. So that's the brunt of it, right?
Yeah.
And that's where most of our focus needs to be on, right? Again, there is also a very interesting correlation here, which is, again, who usually has to have those late-term abortions? Poorer people, people that cannot get a referral, people that do not have medical, that have to jump through many different hoops, right? And this is a lengthy process at times, right? And people, sometimes women that are malnourished with like some sort of food emergency, they don't develop the symptoms much later on when there is part of this threshold is already behind them. So
Yeah.
those are my concerns.
Or
frankly.
people like Wendy was talking about who have lots of family and societal pressure, and then finally later into the pregnancy happen to find a social escape from that kind of oppressive environment. I wanted to say about the analogy to contraception, similarly preventing a potentially net positive life. It's not just the hypothetical. The Catholic Church, in its way, does criminalize contraception. It does criminalize the attempt to avoid bringing what it considers to be positive lives into existence. And so when I make the distinction between what I consider moral actions and what ought to be criminalized, I'll turn it back on Travis and ask you from a sort of pro-natalist, utilitarian, utility maximizing perspective, even if you don't share it, just, how would you justify that distinction, not attempting to criminalize contraception?
I don't think there necessarily is a distinction, right? It's just going to depend on the utility, right? Like, if it were the case, I'm not saying this is the case, but if it were the case that criminalizing contraception would result in more happiness than the suffering it caused, I think you would, as a utilitarian, have to say that we should criminalize contraception. I don't think there necessarily is a distinction.
Can I add on to that, Travis? Would that also mean that you'd have to have some kind of an enforcement to procreate once a month?
I mean, if that raised utility, then yes. I don't know if it actually would. I'm not actually making a claim.
Yeah, but
that
if it
I'm just
would,
saying-
there's no rule in mind that you would want people to have their freedoms to choose to not have children if it increased utility.
Well, yeah, because utilitarianism, well, I guess it depends on the type of utilitarianism. At least if you're a hedonic utilitarian, you're not going to intrinsically value freedom. You're just going to care about the effect on like happiness and suffering in the world.
Yeah, I happily bite that bullet. The reason why I don't want to criminalize lack of maximum procreating, I mean, number one is that currently the existence of extra humans overwhelmingly tends to be a net harm to the well-being in the universe, mostly because of consumption of animal products from factory farms. And secondly, because of the huge collateral damage of using state violence in the form of police and prisons to try to enforce morality. It always, to my understanding of history, backfires. Unless there's a large majority of moral consensus in place before the criminal law gets applied.
Yeah, I just don't think. I think it's fine to have the stance you have, because it's inside the woman, that you want her to have this freedom to choose, any element of added policing. But if you're going to accept the added policing of somebody that takes out their child 1 day after birth, or 10 days after birth, or 2 years after birth, having that arbitrary line there, I just don't think adds up. But maybe the combination of things do. I just don't think the policing's fair to call that a reason for it.
I think that's why the emotional approach is so problematic, right? because as you can see here, we are talking about different angles of the emotional and ethical, moral approach, and it is complicated. We can defend this from any number of points. That's why I think that the moral argument should be the last one in line. It should be present also, right? Because we are a moral society. We are a society that one way or another sustains itself upon certain moralities and etc. And they need to be considered also, right? You cannot simply just ignore that a good chunk of the Americans is evangelical, right? And think
Mhm.
screw them, all right? And I say that as an atheist, right? I don't believe in God. I would much rather not having any sort of religion around and etc. But realistically speaking, those people are out there. They have their rights. They exist, and what I don't want is the other way around. I don't want those sensibilities and morals dictating what everybody else has to do with their own lives. Right. That's why I think
Yeah.
that the current debate regarding abortion is so toxic because it's
Mhm.
basically the baseline is basically religious in the United States.
Hmm.
99%, I think.
Yeah.
Right. We are seeing the politicians, the senators, and etc. making those claims of pro-life, pro-choice. And I was watching the Republican debate a couple of
The
days ago and
primaries.
etc.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And oh my gosh, everybody's a man of God and they are so pro-life and etc. Come on, folks, right? That's not how you
Well,
do legislation, right?
yeah, just so you know, it's not everyone because I agree with you
I know, yeah.
completely that the moral side of it is the lesser side for me. So in my mind, the most important, valuable things you can do starting a society or creating one has no connection to morals whatsoever. It would just be mutual benefit. So I say
Mhm.
we look at humans, we say we want to have this society where we protect humans from being killed, we protect humans from being harmed, punched, and people hear me say all the time that even if we could get it down to the level of protecting humans from being tapped on the shoulder if they don't want to, any form of infringing on people's liberties, I don't want, and not because of morals at all. But if my reasoning didn't exist, then the moral reasoning would work for all of this. But I think all of this works for a mutual benefit. You don't kill me, I don't kill you, and it's just it works out for everyone. And that's the reason why in a perfect society with the right amount of resources, my stance on abortion is actually no abortions even at conception, and it's not for morals at all. I don't take a moral stance until sentience kicks in around 12 weeks. At 12 weeks, I care about the sentience of that, but the very pointless living human from conception to 12 weeks, that thing has no matter to me whatsoever. But I don't want to live in a society where the government chooses at what age to not protect human life. Now, we don't need to get in a debate about if it's silly to care about a zygote that has no meaning. But my framing around it is the idea of I want to feel safe in my society, and I don't want there to be people choosing what can and can't happen. Like, can the government have control to kill somebody because they committed a crime that makes the government feel like they're able to kill somebody? So that's why I'm against the death penalty. I'm against abortion. We protect humans at all costs. And then separate from that, if enough people agree on a moral outcome, then that's why, like Jeremy said, we don't criminalize eating animals right now because the majority think it's morally acceptable. If the Hopefully we can convince the majority to not think it's morally acceptable to circumcise babies, and we can make that part illegal, and we can base our laws around morals in these other cases. But having protection from the government, I just think is valuable for mutual benefit.
I just want to hop in here. I'm not really sure. Like, if we're making legal prescriptions, what we would be basing it off, if not morality.
Mutual
Like,
benefit.
Science.
when you talk, wait, what did Marcelo say?
I think he said
I said
science.
science, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think science can tell you what laws we should have.
I think it
Well,
can.
real
Can
quick
you give
though.
an example? Like,
Okay.
what's
Abortion.
an example of a law that science prescribes?
I think that, for instance, in my home country, you could go to jail if you didn't vaccinate your children. I think that's absolutely a good stance, right? Because there's no drawback.
Before we continue along this
Yeah.
line, on YouTube, we can't use the C word, but you can use the word you just used and go on.
I'm
Okay.
sorry. Okay.
Travis, in case it's not clear, I fully agree with you that political judgments are based upon morality, and I find it hard to see what else they would be based upon. It's just that, accept consequentialism, and if, as a matter of fact, we had magic wands that could change the state of the world, it would be a very different situation from attempting to change the world through violence in the hands of the state in the form of police and courts and prisons, with all of their corruption, their perverse incentives, their mistakes, and just their cost of operations. And that it's just often much better to pursue improvements in well-being through what are generally referred to as civil means, through argument and persuasion and charity and so forth. So it's not. I'm not stepping outside of morality. I'm just saying that the moral calculation it involves huge cost and uncertainty and potential corruption and retaliatory effects like black markets, organized crime, and in the worst situation, civil war and anarchy in response to moral judgments being imposed upon an unwilling population by the state.
Mm-hmm.
Can I give an example to Travis? I was giving you the example of science that I was mentioning. Let's look then at the other side of the scale, right? End of life, termination of life, right? I believe that everybody should be able to decide, okay, my life ends here, and etc. I have a terminal condition or something like that. I think this is an act of self-affirmation, all right, of your liberties, of your existence, and etc. That people that defend the moral argument say that's immoral, right? So that shouldn't happen, and etc. Because every life is God-given, or whatever else that they do, right? And in this case, then what's the deciding factor? Skipping the morality part, right? I think that herein goes science, right? You go to the doctors. The doctor said, okay, this person has a terminal illness, all right? Cannot do it, very painful. This person has a very short lifespan, very poor quality, right? So we are giving the go, okay, this person can choose to terminate his own life under certain conditions. Then you go with the psychologist, talk to the psychologist attest to the scenario, right? Then you have a very good validation that's scientific, just something that should, in my opinion, skip completely the moral argument, right? That is the kind of scenario that I'm talking about. And of course, science is not the only arbiter, all right? But in this scenario of life and death, I think science is a good neutral definer.
Yeah, I don't think you can base laws off science. Like in the example of parents should vaccinate their children, I don't think there's any scientific fact that entails that parents should vaccinate their children. Like science can tell you that, well, if you vaccinate your children, it'll make them less likely to die, but science can't tell you that you should make your child less likely to die. That should be I don't think science can make legal prescriptions. There's some moral judgment going on there that it's bad for parents to be neglectful to their children, or I don't see how just science alone can get you to that political judgment.
Wow, you don't reject the is-ought gap? How controversial. Yeah,
I think that
there's
the
never
law
been any. Yeah.
The science here is not like one of the powers, not the executive or judiciary. No, science here is the arbiter that emboldens and allows us to enact good legislation, right?
So you're saying that science should guide our morals?
Yeah, there always needs to be at least
not
one
our morals,
one moral
our laws.
premise,
Okay.
you know.
Yeah.
This should really not be
Because-
controversial. I've never heard any
Then we can go in-
halfway reasonable attempt to justify the opposite. There has to be at least one moral premise that's introduced into the argument to combine with all the scientific
Well, I
views in order to
I don't
get
think
to
so,
a
and
moral
that's-
conclusion.
That's why I wanted to challenge Travis on what he was saying. So, like with my stance of the most important elements of societal laws would be mutual benefit. If we're all living out in the wild, we have no society, and then a group of 10,000 of us decide we're going to get together, we're going to declare what our borders are, and we live together, and the only law we're going to have is it is illegal to kill anybody. You don't kill me, I don't kill you. It's not illegal because it's immoral. It's illegal because we each don't want it to happen to ourselves, and therefore, if we agree to not do it to each other, then that'll be a good outcome, and we can all benefit from it. And anybody that fails and does it because of our government, because we started a society, they put you in jail, and let's just say you're in jail for life. We can ignore if that should happen or not, or we don't have to worry about death penalty or anything. But I don't think there's a moral component to that at all, and I think that's probably the best thing, the best element of a society is that one thing I just said right there.
So
Okay, so I guess there's one. I guess I can make a qualification here. I think it's possible for something to exist that can be reasonably called politics, which is not grounded in morality. I think Travis, you're talking about like some kind of legitimate grounding of politics, and a legitimate politics should be grounded in moral considerations. But sure, if you could describe like the biggest guy with the biggest club making everybody do his bidding, and then having some henchmen who can enforce their own authority in the clan, you could describe that as politics of a sort that's not necessarily grounded in any justifiable morality. But yeah, so I guess I kind of agree with what both Carson and Travis are saying.
Yeah, I mean, I should clarify my view. I don't necessarily think that, like, morality, moral judgments, I don't think that's a necessary component to make, like, political or legal prescriptions. But you do need some sort of normative component, right? Like, Carson, this kind of, what you're talking about is maybe not a moral norm, but it's a prudential norm, like there has to be some sort of normative component to it. Like, I don't think you can get to a political judgment just out of just on descriptive facts.
Well, I think the
Like, even
normative
if it's
element would just be that everybody benefits from it. It would be not murdering each other, not punching each other. It gets dicey when you add in like property, because as Locke says, we don't have endless resources. But anything that comes down to violence, where any individual wouldn't want it to themselves, it just comes down to the mutual benefit. Although it becomes complicated when it comes to children, but yeah.
Travis, would you say that then in this primitive clan where the biggest guy with the biggest club says, if any of you doesn't do what I want, I'll kill you, and then they do what he wants, would you describe that as not yet political until some point where he says, in addition, it's right and proper that whoever is strongest gets other people to do what he wants? That's the point when it becomes political, is when this moral consideration gets added to the pre-existing.
I don't think politics necessarily requires a moral component to it, but I think, like, in practice, for virtually all people who make political judgments, there's a moral component to it.
Or normative.
But I think, like,
normative. You said normative.
Yeah, I would say
there doesn't seem to be
normative.
anything normative in just the biggest guy saying, "Hey, I will choose to kill you if you don't choose to do what I want," and then people with their own preservation in mind do what he wants. There doesn't seem anything normative in that.
Well, if you're saying the law should be such, or that people should obey me because I am the biggest or strongest or whatever it was.
Right.
I
Once
would
he says
say
that,
that's normative.
once he says that, then it would be political because there would be a normative. But he doesn't have to say that. You don't have to say, you should obey me because I'm stronger. You can just say, I just am stronger and I will kill you if you don't obey me. And there's not a normative statement in there yet, it seems to me.
Okay, yeah, I don't think if you're describing it like that, I don't think I would call it political.
All
But
right.
I don't think you can get from descriptive premises to a normative conclusion. I don't think that makes any sense.
I agree. I fully agree with the vast majority of philosophers other than Sam Harris and Ayn Rand.
My two favorite philosophers. Okay. Before we hop off here, does anybody want to throw in any last thoughts on this? And we were talking about abortion in general, but as far as any last thoughts, the vote that's coming up, or that's currently happening and will be finalized tomorrow, is should it be a ban at 12 weeks or a ban at 20 weeks? So does anybody have any final thoughts for anybody listening that is one of the senators for the project, deciding if they want the ban to be at 12 or 20 weeks?
Yeah, I'll just say that let's not forget we are talking about people, right? With of course, this is a thought experiment in a society that doesn't exist and etc. But we are grounding ourselves in reality, right? So let's not forget that besides all the sophistry and etc., we are talking about real people, real lives, and we have to do the thing that makes sense to promote a good society. And people, it has been shown throughout history that women will have abortion for a number of reasons. Doesn't matter if they're conservative, they're liberal, doesn't matter, right? That's how life itself is organized nowadays. So if that is a reality, and we understand that up to 90 something percent of all abortions are up to the 20th week, I think that's a great cutaway point to have a middle ground, right? That would be my position.
I would vote for 20-week with the caveat that banning, which again is an extremely vague word, doesn't mean treating abortions after 20 weeks as first-degree murder, but some much lesser punishment that aims to create an incentive to reduce those abortions effectively, without the risk of huge collateral damage from greatly empowering the police and the prisons.
All right. Travis, you want to end it?
Yeah, there's just a few things that were said in the chat that I wanted to respond to. This person, Vegan Stallion, says third trimester abortion is exceedingly rare and is only done in the case of saving the life of the mother. So in regards to the claim that it's only done in the case of saving the life of the mother, this is a claim that I've seen pro-choicers make a lot, but I've actually never seen this claim substantiated, that it's only done for saving the life of the mother. That's like an empirical claim that you would have to provide evidence to substantiate.
And ethically, yeah, if that's what a pro-choicer is going to stand on when it comes to that, then what's their problem with criminalizing it except for saving the life of the mother? You know,
definitely.
They have this literature, they have this philosophical literature, this bodily autonomy literature that explicitly justifies third trimester abortion.
Yeah, I will point out. Oh, were you going to say something?
Well, and they don't. The same people who would make that kind of argument to you in one context will make the bodily autonomy up until birth argument in another context, and that's it. It's just inconsistent, right?
Well, I just wanted to point out that there was an article by this fact-checking website called factcheck.org, which is, just so no one comes in and says it, this is not a right-wing site. This is a nonpartisan site. But they did, back in like 2015 or 2016, Hillary Clinton made the claim that most late-term abortions were done out of medical necessity. Mm-hmm. And this fact-checking site came to the conclusion that there's insufficient evidence to substantiate that claim. So maybe since then there's new empirical evidence that has come out, but if there has, I've never seen it. That's just something
let's just ask.
Yeah.
let's just ask Vegan Stallion if he repudiates the typical pro-choice reaction to the violinist thought experiment from a very famous Judith Jarvis Thompson paper. The violinist is inherently the purpose of that thought experiment. Much more sentient than a term fetus, right? A fully sentient adult human. And it's a very common pro-choice position to believe that the person who, against their will, was hooked up to this violinist and whose body is required to keep this violinist alive has every right to disconnect themselves and let the violinist die. Stallion, if your point is just that it's so rare, then when there's nothing else to it, then you should. What do you have a problem with somebody disconnecting themselves from someone with the sentience of a typical adult human and letting them die?
I will say, to be fair, it may be that they're not really making a statement about their own values, but they're just attempting to persuade other people by appealing to those people's values. That could be what's going on there.
Mm.
But there also was a comment, but just one more thing on that. That claim is something I see get asserted all the time, but I've never seen it substantiated. Nikki Dorr says murder should not be legal. Abortion is murder. Say whatever legal philosophical morals you want. That's fact. That's science. Yeah, so it's not a scientific fact that murder or that abortion is murder or that a murder should not be legal. Science itself says nothing about the moral status of abortion.
I was about to mention that specific comment exactly. I think it's ludicrous to say that equate those two things. It's not simply there. I've shared here in the private chat. Sorry, I'm not logged into the whole thing here, but I've shared here the CDC surveillance system on abortion and etc. And there you have all the data, the variables, and etc. to see exactly what kind of abortion happens and when. There you will see that the late term abortion after 21st week and etc. is an aberration in statistics, right? And it's done almost always to preserve the life of the mother. Yeah, it will show there.
We should never. We should never lose sight of proportionality and the fact that the average American is doing something much morally worse. Much morally worse in their dietary choices to consume animal products, the products of unimaginable torture in large numbers.
Yeah, I get pro-lifers get mad at me a lot. They're like, "Oh, so you're against eating eggs, but you're fine with killing a non-sentient embryo." It's like, well, yeah, eating eggs is a lot worse than killing a non-sentient embryo.
As a non-vegan, all right, I understand that this has an added layer of complexity for vegans. I'm absolutely on it. Yeah, I understand it.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think there's probably a lot we could say. Travis, I'll let you say one more thing, but right after that, I think we'll close out so we can all get going. But yeah, what's up, Travis?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one last comment on here. This Vegan Stallion says, "I'm a soft anti-natalist. Life is pretty sucky for most people. Better to never be born." Even if you're an anti-natalist, a lot of the anti-natalists that I've seen make a distinction between a life worth starting and a life worth continuing. I don't think anti-natalism necessarily gets you to the position that abortion is morally acceptable, especially if you're talking about it at the point where the fetus is sentient. If you're an anti-natalist, I would just ask you, well, would you be okay with killing a newborn infant to spare them the suffering of life? And if not, what's the morally relevant difference between a newborn infant and a sentient fetus that, justifies killing the sentient fetus to spare them the suffering of life?
Yep. All right. Well, it was a good talk, guys. I'll see some of you tomorrow, and I'll see the rest of you later.
Okay. Bye.
Have a
All
good
right,
day.
take care.
Bye.